History remembers great battles. It remembers legendary generals. It remembers shining armor, roaring war cries, and triumphant victories. But history rarely remembers the one thing that made all of those victories possible: food. Imagine standing on a hill as the Roman army marches below. The line of soldiers stretches far beyond the horizon. 150,000 men, thousands of pack animals, miles of supply wagons. A moving city unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Now imagine that city waking up tomorrow morning. Before a single sword is drawn, before a single arrow is fired, every one of those 150,000 soldiers expects breakfast. Not next week. Not tomorrow night. Today. Because hungry soldiers don't fight. They don't march. They don't conquer empires. They collapse. Most people believe Rome conquered the ancient world because its soldiers were better trained or because its weapons were superior. But the truth is far less glamorous and far more fascinating. Rome didn't build an empire with swords alone. It built an empire with bread. Every military campaign began with a question that had nothing to do with battle. How do you feed an army this large every single day? Think about the scale for a moment. An army of 150,000 men consumed an astonishing amount of food every day in this adapted scenario. Not just grain, but water, salt, cooking oil, fuel for campfires, and feed for thousands of mules, carrying everything the army needed to survive. Without a constant flow of supplies, the greatest army in the world would become nothing more than a crowd of starving men. The Romans understood something that many of their enemies never did. Winning a battle was impressive. Keeping an army alive afterward was much harder. That is why they created one of history's most sophisticated logistical systems. Long before trucks, long before railways, long before computers, Roman officials calculated food supplies, organized transport routes, protected warehouses, and tracked inventories with remarkable precision. Every sack of grain mattered. Every mule mattered. Every road mattered. Because one broken supply line could destroy an entire campaign without the enemy ever winning a battle. In fact, many Roman commanders feared hunger more than enemy swords. A starving legion could lose its discipline within days. Exhaustion would spread. Disease would follow. Morale would collapse. And soon, the mighty Roman army would begin to destroy itself from within. This is the story that history books rarely tell. Not the story of emperors. Not the story of famous battles. But the story of the invisible machine that kept an empire alive. The roads. The granaries. The ships. The pack animals. The accountants. The engineers. And the millions of ordinary people whose labor placed bread into the hands of soldiers standing hundreds of miles away. Because in ancient Rome, victory was never decided only by courage. It was decided by whoever could still place food on the table when everyone else had run out. Today, we're going to uncover how Rome managed to feed 150,000 soldiers, day after day, campaign after campaign, and why this extraordinary logistical system became one of the greatest secrets behind the rise of the Roman Empire. If the sword was the weapon that allowed Rome to win battles, then wheat was what kept that sword raised. For the Roman legions, food was never just a necessity. It was the fuel that powered one of the greatest military machines in history. In this adapted scenario, maintaining the combat strength of 150,000 soldiers would require approximately 150 tons of wheat every single day. Even by modern logistical standards, that is an extraordinary amount of food. If supplies were delayed for only a few days, an entire military campaign could quickly descend into crisis. Surprisingly, contrary to what many people imagine, meat was not the primary food of the Roman army. Roman soldiers relied mainly on grain. Wheat and barley formed the foundation of their daily diet because they provided the slow, steady energy needed for exhausting marches that often lasted from sunrise to sunset. Through centuries of experience, Roman commanders discovered that soldiers living on a grain-rich diet could endure longer campaigns than those who relied heavily on meat. Today, Modern sports nutrition refers to this principle as carbohydrate loading, but the Romans had already learned it through generations of military experience. Yet the true brilliance of Rome's food system wasn't only what the soldiers ate. It was how they stored and transported it. The Romans did not transport fresh bread, nor did they carry sacks of ready-made flour. Instead, their supply trains hauled whole, unprocessed grain. The reason was remarkably practical. Fresh bread spoiled within days. Even flour could absorb moisture and deteriorate quickly. Whole grain, however, could remain edible for months or even years if stored properly in dry conditions. That simple decision solved one of the greatest logistical challenges of the ancient world. Every evening, after hours of marching beneath the weight of heavy armor, another routine began throughout the Roman camp. The sound of portable stone hand mills echoed between the tents. Each group of soldiers took turns grinding wheat into flour. It was exhausting work. After spending an entire day marching, digging defensive trenches, and building a fortified camp, they still had to prepare their own food from scratch. Yet the Romans never viewed this as an unnecessary burden. It was simply another responsibility of military life. Once enough flour had been produced, campfires flickered across the encampment. Some soldiers shaped the dough into simple unleavened flatbreads and baked them directly on hot stones. Others cooked a thick porridge by mixing the flour with water, seasoning it with a little salt and a few drops of olive oil. This humble dish, known as pulse, far from luxurious, but it was rich in calories and restored strength after a long day's march. Another remarkable feature of the Roman army was that officers often shared the same food as ordinary legionaries during difficult campaigns. Eating from the same pot was more than a practical arrangement. It was a powerful symbol of unity. When every man endured the same hardships, discipline became stronger and loyalty deepened. Only after returning to peaceful provinces did differences in rank become more visible through better quality rations for senior officers. Food was only half of the equation. Water was equally important. Roman soldiers frequently mixed water with a small amount of sour wine to create a drink called pasca. The acidity helped kill harmful bacteria commonly found in untreated water, while also making it more refreshing during the intense summer heat. It served as an ancient military drink that was both practical and surprisingly effective. Quality control was taken just as seriously as distribution. Every shipment of grain was carefully inspected before reaching the soldiers. Any wheat that showed signs of mold, moisture, or insect damage was immediately discarded. Roman quartermasters understood that throwing away spoiled grain was far less costly than allowing thousands of soldiers to become sick from contaminated food. This relentless attention to food quality became one of the hidden reasons behind the extraordinary endurance of the Roman legions. They did not depend on lavish feasts. They did not require luxurious meals. With nothing more than sacks of wheat, a portable hand mill, and a small campfire, they could feed an entire army in the middle of hostile territory. Ironically, it was this simplicity that became one of Rome's greatest strengths. From something as ordinary as wheat, the empire created a military force capable of marching thousands of kilometers while remaining ready for battle at any moment. But delivering 150 tons of grain every single day was an even greater challenge than preparing it. In the next chapter, we'll explore the enormous transportation network that made this possible: a system of pack mules, stone roads, rivers, merchant ships, and supply columns that ensured the most powerful army of the ancient world never marched on an empty stomach. Supplying food for an army was only half the battle. The other half was getting that food to the soldiers before they ran out. For Rome, this was perhaps the greatest challenge of all. In our adapted scenario, an army of 150,000 soldiers required roughly 150 tons of grain every day. But grain was only one part of the cargo. Water, olive oil, salt, tools, tents, spare weapons, cooking equipment, and fodder for thousands of animals all had to move with the army. The amount of supplies was staggering. Without trucks, without railways, without engines, the Romans had to rely entirely on muscle, both human and animal. The true heroes of Roman logistics were not the famous generals. They were the thousands of humble pack mules. Unlike horses, mules were incredibly hardy. They could travel across rocky mountains, muddy valleys, and narrow forest trails where wagons simply could not go. They required less food than cavalry horses and could continue working for long periods with minimal care. For this reason, the mule became the backbone of Rome's transportation system. Historical records describe how almost every squad of soldiers was responsible for its assigned pack animal. These mules carried leather tents, portable hand mills, cooking pots, spare tools, and many of the daily necessities required to build a fortified camp every evening. Losing one of them was treated almost as seriously as losing valuable military equipment. Because without the mule, soldiers could no longer carry everything they needed to survive. A healthy mule could carry around 100 kilograms of cargo while marching nearly 30 kilometers in a single day. That may not sound extraordinary today, but multiplied by thousands of animals, it allowed Rome to move enormous quantities of supplies across difficult terrain. Behind every Roman legion stretched an endless caravan of pack animals, quietly doing the work that made every military victory possible. Large wooden wagons were also used, but only for transporting the heaviest equipment. Siege engines, construction materials, the command tents of senior officers. Unfortunately, wagons had one major weakness. Roman campaigns rarely followed smooth roads. Enemy territory was filled with rocky tracks, muddy fields, steep hills, and broken bridges. Heavy wagons often became stuck or broke apart under the strain. Pack mules simply walked around the obstacles. Roman engineers quickly realized that mobility was often more valuable than carrying larger loads. A slower convoy meant a slow army, and a slower army gave the enemy more time to prepare. Yet transporting supplies created another problem. The transport animals themselves needed food. Thousands of mules consumed enormous quantities of grass, hay, and grain every day. In other words, the Roman army wasn't only carrying food for its soldiers. It was also carrying food for the animals that carried the food. This created a remarkable logistical cycle. Every calculation became critical. Quartermasters carefully determined exactly how many days an army could continue marching before reaching the next supply point. If they made even a small mistake, the entire system could collapse. An army could literally begin consuming its own transportation network. That is why Roman commanders treated mathematics as a weapon. They calculated distances, travel speeds, daily consumption, weather conditions, river crossings. Everything was planned long before the first soldier left camp. Protecting these supply columns became just as important as protecting the soldiers themselves. Enemy commanders understood this perfectly. Rather than attacking disciplined Roman legions head-on, many chose an easier target: the supply train. A successful ambush against a convoy could starve an entire army without fighting a major battle. Narrow mountain passes, dense forests, and deep valleys became ideal locations for surprise attacks. For that reason, even mule drivers carried weapons. If necessary, they fought alongside the soldiers to defend the precious cargo that kept the army alive. The Romans also understood that no transportation system could survive without infrastructure. Across the empire, they built thousands of kilometers of stone roads. Many people assumed these roads were designed mainly for trade. Trade certainly benefited from them, but their primary purpose was military. Straight, durable roads allowed supply columns to travel farther, faster, and more reliably in almost any weather. They connected forts with warehouses, warehouses with ports, ports with frontier legions. Every road became another artery feeding Rome's military machine. Whenever possible, however, the Romans preferred not to move heavy cargo by land at all. Water was far more efficient. Merchant ships sailing across the Mediterranean could transport thousands of tons of grain using little more than favorable winds. Flat-bottomed barges carried supplies along rivers like the Rhine and the Danube, where moving cargo by water was far cheaper and faster than using wagons. River patrols guarded these vessels constantly because losing a grain convoy could threaten an entire frontier campaign. Pirates, enemy tribes, and even severe storms all posed serious dangers to Rome's floating supply lines. By combining roads, rivers, merchant fleets, pack mules, and carefully organized supply columns, Rome created a transportation network unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. It allowed armies to appear hundreds of miles from home while remaining supplied for months. But even the greatest transportation system needed somewhere to store its supplies safely. And that brings us to the next piece of Rome's logistical masterpiece. In the next chapter, we'll explore the vast network of granaries, supply depots, and meticulous record-keeping that transformed simple sacks of wheat into the lifeblood of an empire. An army could march for thousands of kilometers, but grain could not remain forever on the backs of pack animals. Sooner or later, those enormous supplies had to be stored somewhere safe. That is why the Roman Empire built an extensive network of granaries across its territories, a system that many historians consider the true heart of Rome's military machine. In this adapted scenario, an army of 150,000 soldiers would require approximately 150 tons of wheat every day. No supply convoy could possibly carry enough food for months of campaigning. Instead of transporting all of their provisions at once, the Romans established supply depots at strategic locations so their armies could replenish their stores as they advanced. These granaries were far more than ordinary storage buildings. They were specially engineered to preserve grain for long periods. Their floors were raised above the ground. Air circulated continuously through the structure. Moisture was carefully controlled. Rats and insects were kept away through thoughtful architectural design. Under ideal conditions, wheat could remain usable for many months and sometimes for as long as 2 years. This gave the Roman army an enormous strategic advantage. The soldiers no longer had to carry their entire food supply on their backs. Instead, they simply marched from one supply depot to the next. The distance between these depots was typically planned to match roughly 5 days of marching. This dramatically reduced the weight each army had to transport while increasing the speed and flexibility of military campaigns. Yet, constructing the granaries was only the beginning. Managing them efficiently was even more important. The Romans were famous for their discipline. That discipline extended far beyond the battlefield. Every month, each granary underwent a detailed inventory. Every sack of grain, every tool, every piece of military equipment. Everything was carefully recorded on wax tablets or papyrus scrolls. Not a single bag of wheat was allowed to disappear without explanation. Today, inventory management is often viewed as a modern business practice. But the Romans had already applied many of its core principles more than 2,000 years ago. They knew exactly how much food remained in every warehouse, how many days each legion could be sustained, and precisely when fresh supplies had to arrive from the rear. These numbers determined when a campaign could begin, how fast an army could advance, and how long it could continue fighting. The officers responsible for these granaries held tremendous authority. They decided which legion would receive freshly harvested grain, and which units would have to rely on supplies left over from the previous year. One poor decision could directly affect the health, morale, and combat readiness of thousands of soldiers. For that reason, corruption within the supply system was treated as one of the gravest crimes. Historical records describe severe punishment: 7 public execution for officials who stole military provisions during wartime. To the Romans, stealing food from the army was no different from betraying the soldiers fighting on the front lines. Rome's supply network also operated according to a principle that closely resembles what we now call continuous replenishment. As armies drew grain from forward depots and continued their campaigns, farmers and supply convoys in the rear constantly delivered fresh shipments to replace what had been consumed. Supplies were always flowing. The logistical chain rarely stopped moving. It was a continuous cycle that allowed Rome's military machine to remain operational year after year. Of course, even the best plans could fail. Winter was one of logistics' greatest enemies. Heavy snow, deep mud, relentless rain. Together, they could make overland transportation nearly impossible. Moving grain became an enormous challenge. As a result, most Roman military campaigns slowed dramatically or stopped altogether during the winter months. Legions withdrew to winter quarters near major supply depots and waited for roads to become passable again before resuming operations. To prevent shortages, Roman quartermasters often began preparing an entire year in advance. They purchased grain harvests early from provinces expected to support future campaigns. These massive purchases frequently drove wheat prices higher and had a noticeable impact on local economies. In other words, war did not reshape only battlefields. It also transformed agricultural markets throughout the Roman Empire. Rome's enemies understood the importance of these granaries just as well. Before campaigns even began, spies and raiding parties often attempted to burn supply depots to the ground. A single fire could reduce thousands of tons of precious grain to worthless ashes. That is why Roman granaries were usually constructed from stone and thick brick rather than wood. Strong walls surrounded them. Deep ditches protected them. Permanent garrisons guarded them day and night. To the Romans, a granary could be more valuable than a fortress. A lost fortress might eventually be retaken. A destroyed food supply could bring an entire military campaign to an end within weeks. In many ways, these granaries were the beating hearts of Rome's war machine. But what happened when every supply route failed? When the warehouses were destroyed? When the convoys never arrived? When hunger became stronger than discipline? In the next chapter, we'll witness the nightmare every Roman commander feared most: an army forced to survive by searching for food in enemy territory, where every meal had to be won before the next battle could even begin. No logistical system, no matter how sophisticated, was perfect. Roads could be washed away by torrential rain. Bridges could collapse without warning. Merchant ships could disappear beneath violent storms. Entire granaries could be reduced to ashes by enemy raiders. When those things happened, Rome's greatest military advantage suddenly became its greatest weakness. An army of 150,000 soldiers could consume its food reserves at an astonishing speed. Without fresh supplies arriving from the rear, commanders knew they had only one option. The army would have to feed itself. Not by chance, not through uncontrolled looting, but through a carefully organized military operation known as foraging. Every morning, officers selected detachments whose only mission was to search the surrounding countryside for food. This was far more organized than many people imagine. Half of the army usually remained inside the fortified camp to guard the supplies and defend the position. The other half spread across the countryside in disciplined formations, searching for anything that could keep the army alive. They inspected barns, storehouses, villages, fields, even hidden underground grain pits built by local farmers. Nothing escaped their attention. The Romans even developed techniques for finding concealed food caches. Farmers often buried grain beneath the soil and carefully disguised the ground with fresh grass, hoping invading armies would pass by without noticing. Experienced Roman soldiers learned to recognize the smallest disturbances in the earth. Using long iron spears, they probed suspicious patches of ground until they discovered hidden storage pits. It became a deadly game of survival between desperate villagers trying to protect their families and an invading army determined to stay alive. Livestock became another valuable prize. Unlike sacks of grain, cattle and sheep could walk on their own. There was no need to carry them. Captured herds were driven back to the Roman camp, carefully counted by officers, and distributed as emergency rations. Ironically, however, .35's most Roman soldiers still preferred grain whenever it was available. Long campaigns had conditioned their bodies to wheat and barley. When forced to survive on meat alone, many legionaries reportedly suffered digestive problems and rapidly lost their usual stamina. For them, meat was not a luxury. It was often a sign that supplies had become dangerously low. Yet foraging came with enormous risks. Soldiers searching for food had to leave the safety of the fortified camp. Small groups moving through forests and valleys became perfect targets for enemy ambushes. Local resistance fighters knew the land far better than the Romans. They waited patiently among the trees, attacking isolated detachments before disappearing again into the countryside. That is why Roman foragers rarely traveled alone. Even while gathering food, they marched in full armor, carrying shields and weapons, always prepared to fight at a moment's notice. But perhaps the greatest danger was not the enemy. It was time. Every day spent searching for food was a day not spent advancing. An army constantly occupied with feeding itself could no longer conduct sieges. It could not launch major offensives. The entire campaign slowed almost to a standstill. Commanders understood that logistics, more than combat, often determined the outcome of war. Rome's enemies recognized this weakness and exploited it whenever possible. Instead of confronting the legions directly, many adopted a brutal strategy known today as scorched earth. Fields were burned. Harvests were destroyed. Wells were poisoned with animal carcasses. Entire villages abandoned their homes after taking every edible item they could carry. The Romans arrived expecting to find supplies. Instead, they found an empty landscape incapable of feeding even a single legion. As shortages became more severe, discipline began to crack. Daily grain rations were reduced. First by a small amount, then by half. Eventually, desperate soldiers started hiding whatever food they found instead of turning it over to the common supply. Roman commanders punished such behavior harshly. Every piece of food belonged to the army, not the individual. The survival of the entire force always came before the interests of any single soldier. If the crisis continued, the consequences became catastrophic. Exhaustion spread rapidly. Disease followed close behind. Marching speed declined. Desertion increased. Some armies were eventually forced to slaughter their own pack mules simply to keep the soldiers alive for a few more days. It was a desperate decision. The men survived, but the transportation system that carried their supplies was destroyed in the process. The army saved itself today, only to lose its ability to move tomorrow. For Roman commanders, this was the ultimate nightmare. Because once food disappeared, discipline, morale, and military power soon vanished with it. In the final chapter, we'll discover why Rome's greatest weapon was never its swords or its shields, but its unmatched ability to transform organization, mathematics, and logistics into an empire that dominated the ancient world for centuries. When we think about the Roman Empire, we usually picture its seemingly unstoppable legions, the towering rectangular shields, the razor-sharp gladius swords, the disciplined battle formations that conquered much of the Mediterranean world. But, in reality, that was only what happened on the battlefield. Behind every Roman victory stood a vast machine that few people ever noticed. A machine that produced no clash of steel, no dramatic cavalry charges, no heroic duels. Yet it determined the fate of an empire. That machine was logistics. Throughout this journey, we've seen that feeding an army of 150,000 soldiers required far more than simply gathering hundreds of tons of grain every day. It required farmers planting crops months in advance. It required granaries strategically built across the empire. It required thousands of pack mules quietly carrying sacks of wheat over mountains and valleys. It required stone roads connecting distant provinces, busy ports constantly receiving shipments of grain, quartermasters carefully recording every sack, every tool, and every day's supply. And above all, it required a disciplined administrative system capable of keeping every link in the chain working flawlessly. If even one of those links failed, a bridge destroyed, a supply convoy ambushed, a granary burned to the ground, or a harvest ruined by bad weather, an army that once seemed invincible could quickly find itself facing disaster. History has shown time and again that many armies were not defeated by enemy swords. They were defeated by hunger. That is why Roman commanders understood one simple truth. A hungry soldier cannot fight pause.
0.6.
An army without bread cannot maintain discipline. And an empire that cannot sustain its supply lines cannot continue to expand. Before they could win battles, they first had to win the war of logistics. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson Rome left behind. True strength does not come from weapons alone. It comes from organization, preparation, discipline, and the ability to transform millions of small tasks into one unified system. That is how the Roman Empire sustained military campaigns lasting for months, 7 years, thousands of kilometers from home, while preserving its remarkable fighting power. What is truly fascinating is that, more than 2,000 years later, that principle has never changed. Modern armies have trucks, cargo aircraft, container ships, satellites, and advanced communication systems. Yet they still face the very same question that Roman generals once asked. How do you deliver the right supplies to the right place at exactly the right time? Because no matter how advanced technology becomes, an army without food will still fail. A campaign without logistics will still collapse. And from ancient Rome to the modern world, war has always been a battle of supply chains. History may forever remember names like Julius Caesar, Trajan, and Scipio. But behind the glory of those great commanders stood countless ordinary people. The farmers, the mule drivers, the sailors, the quartermasters, the warehouse keepers. They were never honored in triumphal parades. Their names were never carved into victory monuments. Yet they were the people who quietly sustained an empire. Because sometimes, the force that changes history is not the sword drawn from its sheath. It's the loaf of bread still resting in a soldier's back.